One sentence was enough to quietly signal one of the biggest shifts in the global economy in modern history. In his first address to Congress, President Joe Biden said, "There is no reason why the blades for wind turbines can be built in Pittsburgh instead of Beijing." On the surface, this sounds like a familiar political promise about jobs and domestic manufacturing, something American politicians have said for decades. But in reality, this single sentence represents a profound break from the economic philosophy that shaped the world for nearly 70 years. It signals that the United States, the country that once designed, defended, and enforced globalization, is now actively reshaping it, and in some ways, reversing it. To understand why this matters, we need to understand the system we live in, a system so familiar that we rarely question it. The phone in your hand, the clothes on your body, the food on your table, the car you drive, and the materials used to build your home are almost certainly the result of production processes that span multiple countries. This is not an accident, and it is not natural. It is the outcome of a carefully constructed global economic system built on specialization, trade, and efficiency. For most of human history, people consumed what was produced locally. Trade existed, but it was limited, slow, and risky. What changed everything was the discovery that when groups of people specialize in producing specific goods and exchange their surplus with others, everyone involved becomes wealthier. This simple idea scaled up over centuries, powered by better ships, better navigation, better finance, and eventually industrialization. By the early 20th century, global trade existed, but it was unstable and fragmented. Countries protected their industries with high tariffs, currencies were volatile, and economic shocks spread quickly. Then came World War II, which devastated much of the world and forced a reckoning. Out of that destruction, the United States emerged as the dominant economic and military power, and instead of retreating inward, it made a historic choice. It decided to build a new global economic order. The US dollar became the world's reserve currency, providing stability and predictability. Tariffs were reduced through international agreements. Capital was allowed to move across borders. Institutions like the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and later the World Trade Organization were created to enforce rules and manage disputes. The goal of this system was not just growth, but peace. The belief was that countries deeply connected through trade would have too much to lose from conflict. For decades, this system appeared to work remarkably well. Global trade expanded at an unprecedented pace. Corporations built supply chains that stretched across continents. Prices fell for consumers. Productivity rose, and hundreds of millions of people were lifted out of poverty. Developing countries gained access to global markets, while consumers in wealthy countries enjoyed cheaper goods than ever before. By the late 20th century, globalization was seen not just as an economic system, but as a moral success story. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, many believed that free markets and liberal democracy had permanently won. China was central to this optimism. When China opened its economy, it did so cautiously but decisively. Special economic zones were created along the coast. Foreign investment poured in. Millions of workers migrated from rural villages to industrial cities, ready to work long hours for low wages. Western corporations saw an opportunity to dramatically reduce costs. Factories that once operated in places like Detroit, Ohio, and Pennsylvania were moved overseas. From a purely economic perspective, this made sense. Production became cheaper, margins increased, and consumers benefited from lower prices. For China, the results were extraordinary. Hundreds of millions of people escaped extreme poverty. A massive middle class emerged. Cities transformed at a pace never before seen in human history. China became the factory of the world. But this success came with costs that were not evenly distributed. In the United States and other advanced economies, entire industries shrank or disappeared. Manufacturing jobs vanished. Communities built around factories collapsed. Economists refer to this phenomenon as the China shock. While the overall economy grew and consumers benefited, many workers were left behind, particularly in industrial regions that never fully recovered. This created economic insecurity, resentment, and a growing belief that the system was rigged. At the same time, income inequality widened. The gains from globalization increasingly flowed to corporations, investors, and highly skilled workers, while wages stagnated for many others. Despite these warning signs, political leaders continued to defend globalization, largely because the overall numbers looked good and because there was a deeper belief underpinning the system. That belief was that economic interdependence would prevent conflict. The idea was simple and intuitive. Countries that trade together do not fight each other. This theory appeared to work in post-war Europe, where former enemies like France and Germany became deeply integrated and peaceful. Many believed the same logic would apply globally, including to China. As China grew richer, the assumption was that it would gradually liberalize politically, integrate into the existing order, and become a responsible stakeholder. That assumption turned out to be wrong. China did not democratize. Instead, it became more centralized, more technologically sophisticated, and more assertive. Economic power translated into geopolitical power. China invested heavily in its military, asserted territorial claims in its region, and expanded its global influence through infrastructure projects and loans. As this happened, the United States began to see China not as a partner in a shared system, but as a strategic rival. This realization fundamentally changed how globalization was perceived. Economic dependence was no longer viewed as harmless efficiency. It began to look like vulnerability. Then came the COVID pandemic, which shattered what remained of public trust in global supply chains. Systems optimized for efficiency and just-in-time delivery proved fragile under stress. Factories shut down, ports closed, and essential goods became scarce. Medical supplies, pharmaceuticals, electronics, and even basic consumer products were suddenly hard to find. Countries realized how dependent they were on distant producers for critical goods. Even if economists argued that supply chains performed better than expected, given the scale of the shock, public perception had already shifted. Globalization no longer felt safe. Around the same time, geopolitics made the risks impossible to ignore. Russia cut off natural gas supplies to Europe, turning energy dependence into a weapon and sending prices soaring. China demonstrated its control over rare earth minerals, materials essential for electronics, batteries, and military equipment. The United States responded by restricting China's access to advanced microchips, the foundation of modern weapon systems and artificial intelligence. Economic relationships were no longer neutral trade arrangements. They had become tools of leverage and pressure. In this new environment, the idea that markets alone should decide where production happens began to feel dangerously naive. Governments around the world started to change course. The United States passed massive subsidy programs like the CHIPS Act, spending tens of billions of dollars to bring semiconductor manufacturing back onto American soil. Tariffs were raised on strategic goods. Foreign investment faced increased scrutiny. Similar shifts happened elsewhere. India pushed aggressively for domestic manufacturing under the banner of self-reliance. Japan paid companies to relocate factories back home or away from China. European countries protected key industries like energy, agriculture, and automobiles. Australia moved to reshore the processing of critical minerals. This global trend has a name: economic nationalism. It does not mean the end of trade, but it does mean the end of blind faith in free markets. Governments are no longer willing to rely solely on efficiency and cost. They are intervening directly to protect jobs, secure supply chains, reduce emissions, and maintain strategic advantage. There are four main forces driving this transformation. The first is employment. Economic insecurity fuels political instability, and governments want to ensure that critical industries provide domestic jobs. The second is climate change. Markets alone do not price environmental damage accurately, so governments are forcing investment into clean energy and green technologies. The third is resilience. Efficiency without reliability is no longer acceptable in a world of pandemics, wars, and geopolitical shocks. The fourth is great power rivalry. The United States and China are competing for technological, economic, and strategic dominance, and neither side is willing to leave that competition entirely to market forces. This moment in history feels uncomfortably familiar. In the 1930s, economic crises led countries to turn inward, raise tariffs, and embrace nationalism, and the result was not stability, but deeper economic pain. and ultimately conflict. History does not repeat itself exactly, but it often rhymes. Globalization is not disappearing, but it is being fundamentally reshaped. The era of pure efficiency is giving way to an era of security, resilience, and political control. Markets are still powerful, but they are increasingly constrained by national priorities. The real question is not whether this shift is good or bad in theory, but whether it will make the world safer or more divided in practice. Are we correcting the flaws of globalization, or are we dismantling the very system that helped prevent major power conflict for decades? That answer will shape the next generation of global politics and economics. Let me know what you think in the comments. I read them all. And if you want more clear, honest explanations of how power, economics, and global systems really work, you already know what to do next.